Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to CRAM. Thanks for joining me as we explore new and innovative research and big ideas that may change the way you think and act. Do you have a philosophy of everyday life? Sort of a general rule, something you try and abide by, or maybe it's just something you believe to be true about life. It could be something like, I try to be a better person, or I'm going to live in the present and enjoy each moment. Or maybe it's, life is suffering, and that's something I accept. I wonder whether many of us may not consciously think about a philosophy of life, but it's actually there, unintentional. Maybe it's buried in our subconscious. And is it foundational in how we approach pretty much everything? These are questions we'll explore with Chris Howard. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at McGill University, and he specializes in ethics and moral philosophy. Hi, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mary. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, I really love this conversation. This is something I think that just sometimes comes up between, friends when we're chatting. But I wanted to start first. I gave a few examples of maybe what could be philosophical approaches to life. But for you as a philosopher, what is actually a philosophical approach to life? How would you see it?
Yeah, great. I think, this notion of a philosophical approach to life can mean lots of different things. For me, the way that I think of it, a philosophical approach to life is sort of a reflective approach to life. In practice, it means evaluating and responding to the world thoughtfully and critically, rather than sort of passively and unreflectively. And this amounts, not only to thinking about your choices, like what you should do, how you should act or behave, but also how you sort of take in or receive information every day, whether it be from, in-person, face-to-face conversations with friends, news sources, posts on social media. How should you respond to that information? What should you believe? I think it's possible to take a sort of critical perspective on that question as well. And I think another sort of critical piece of a philosophical approach to life is sort of trying constantly, persistently to determine what has real value in life and trying to sort of properly orient yourself to the things that it's reasonable to believe really do have value. So again, just sort of very broadly, critically thinking about evaluating and responding to the world in action, in belief, and sort of evaluative attitudes, kinds of things you value.
So I'm wondering whether you think many people do that intentionally, right? Or was it because I was wondering about this, and that's why I put in my introduction. Maybe we have an approach to life, but it's not actually something we think about even. Maybe it's sort of subconscious and it's just sort of an accumulation of different experiences we've had, and we've come to some sort of conclusion about things, and it's there. We don't really question it, and we don't really think critically about it. I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people sort of as a result of their accumulated experiences, sort of respond to things in kind of a habitual, unreflective way. I do think, there are some people who really do sort of actively and critically and consciously think about the world around them, how to navigate it on a fairly consistent basis. I think there are people who are more disposed to do that than others. But I think it's sort of important to highlight that even for people who are sort of disposed to conduct themselves in this way, to think in these ways, it's very easy to slip into kind of unreflective habits of thought, right? Or to deviate even from sort of reflectively chosen or adopted plans. And I think there have got to be, good psychological reasons for this, for our sort of default reactions in lots of cases to be instinctual, immediate, kind of uncritical. In some cases, I think that can even be adaptive. But in other cases, I do think there is some value in trying to cultivate in yourself a disposition to think sort of actively and critically. And I think it takes real work to sort of maintain that sort of philosophical approach to life, the kind I'm describing.
Yeah, well,
And that
exactly. Let me just stop you there. When you
yeah,
say
yeah,
real
please.
work, well, yeah, when you say real work, I mean, right away, I think of Socrates, right? The examined life, and that is a life worth living. People, if they're on default mode most of the time, and they're just getting by fine, right? So I could see the argument, hey, life is fine, life is good. I'm not questioning everything I do. Why should I? Why should I even go down that path and give myself all these dilemmas, right? That then confront me and I've got to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. I
So
mean,
what,
I'd be
yeah.
hard pressed to sort of deny that if things are going good on cruise control, you should somehow exit. I mean, that sounds okay to me. I do think for the vast majority of people, sort of like who have like a diverse range of experiences, living reflectively, taking a more active approach in choosing what to do and thinking about what to believe can be highly practically beneficial. So, thinking carefully about your choices, sort of consciously weighing reasons for and against various courses of action that are open to you, deliberately, reflectively, is often going to lead you, I think, to make better choices on the whole, or at the very least, choices that you're sort of like readily able to justify or explain. And I think
Yeah.
that the point sort of generalizes to the case of belief as well. Carefully considering your evidence, checking yourself and your sources of information for biases is going to lead you to well-supported, reasonable beliefs, which you might think is good in itself, but also in terms of how it's ultimately reflected in action, right?
Mm-hmm.
Relying on sort of well-informed, well-supported beliefs in thinking about what to do is going to help you make better informed and wiser choices. So those are some ways in which I think a sort of reflective approach can be good.
So yeah, I'm thinking about that. And you believe that with critical thought, you're making better choices. And then I'm thinking, okay, so you make better choices, but the person who's on cruise control doesn't really care because they're happy anyway. So why should that person who's on cruise control change his behavior and take a more intentional approach to life? I'm wondering whether there's something fundamental, a connection between a philosophy of life and a sense of purpose, and a sense of why I'm here and what's my motivation and, who am I? I don't know. I just have a feeling it might be wrapped up in that. What do you
Yeah,
think?
absolutely. I mean, I think so this relates to sort of the sort of third aspect of a philosophical approach to life that I mentioned a moment ago. This idea that part of that is sort of spending some time trying to figure out what's ultimately valuable, right? And how to sort of orient yourself rightly to things that you think are valuable in life, which ideally is going to lead you to accumulate more value in your own life, but also a sense of meaning, right? Some sort of like
Meaning, right.
fundamental aim or purpose. Again, I mean, I think there are philosophers who would dispute this, right? So there
Yeah.
are some
Yeah.
philosophers who think, I mean, they're relatively rare, who have a theory of value that says something like, look, the only thing that's really intrinsically good or good in itself is sort of pleasurable experience, right? And so again, it's hard if the person on cruise control is doing just fine. Maybe that's ultimately okay. In my opinion, from my perspective, I think that there's more value out there in the world than sort of like pleasant experience.
Mm-hmm.
There's value in sort of not only sort of deeper meaning, but striving to achieve deeper meaning and purpose in your life. And so I think I'm inclined to agree with you that somehow even the person who's on cruise control and things are going well is missing out on something important by failing to at least sometimes live in sort of like a more reflective, active, critical way.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think about a couple of those examples that I gave in the introduction? We hear them, right? About, I want to be a better person, or I really want to live in the moment. I work so hard and I'm always preoccupied with all kinds of things that, aren't really important to me. So I'm thinking about the past and the future, but never the present. And I want to enjoy the moment more. What do you think about those sort of rules of life.
Yeah, yeah.
Are they worth? Yeah, are they worth following, or are they just a little simplistic? Or
Well,
what do you think?
I think, so I think inevitably these sort of like one or two sentence slogans are too simplistic because life is so complex. The person that you described, who is never living in the moment and always sort of ruminating about the past or looking forward to the future, probably is missing out on something. That being said, maybe the person who's always in the moment and never reflecting carefully about the past or thinking about what's to come is also missing out on some important stuff, right? And so inevitably, I think slogans like that too simplistic, but oftentimes there is a kernel of truth in them, right? So in this particular case, sort of living in and appreciating in the moment, maybe the idea is something like we should be cultivating a sense of gratitude in ourselves for our present circumstances and focus in that, kind of revel in that gratitude rather than thinking about what's happened in the past and what's going to come. Just be grateful for things as they are. And I think as a sort of rule of thumb, if that's what the recommendation is, to kind of cultivate this sort of virtuous disposition of gratitude in ourselves, that's great. But I think the sort of take-home message is rarely accept the slogan at face value. Like, think critically even about the slogan itself and try to derive from it some kernel of truth, what it's really trying to communicate or prescribe, and internalize that.
Yeah. So if, let's say, a person, and I'm going to connect then this philosophy of life with meaning of life, with a sense of purpose. And they are looking at a way of, living their life in a more meaningful way, to look more critically at the choices they make. Like, what goes into that? So what are the questions, or what should they be asking themselves in putting together a kind of philosophy of everyday living?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the things I mentioned before, trying to figure out what's really valuable out there, like spending some real time thinking about what matters to them in their life. What do they think is sort of like our fundamental sources of value for them? And then asking themselves, is my daily behavior, are my life plans oriented toward protecting and preserving or promoting the kinds of things that I think fundamentally matter, right? Because you might talk to someone who you say, what do you really care about, right? And they say, my family and my friends, like those are the things that I really care about.
Yeah.
And then you look at how they act on a day-to-day basis, right? Maybe they're like a workaholic and barely spend any time at home and don't see their friends on the weekends because then there's a kind of fundamental disconnect. And that person would probably benefit from a little bit of critical reflection on how they're actually conducting themselves, given the kinds of things that they claim to value. So I think a lot of this is about sort of like critical self-examination, right? Is there a sort of match in the way that I conduct myself, the way that I treat myself and others, and my beliefs about which things are really sort of a fundamental value? And if there is, then you need to revise, right?
Yeah. Do you know the one I said about, I'd like to be a better person? I do hear people say that, right? I really try to be a better person. And I always think, well, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah.
Because I guess everybody has their own definition of what a better person is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think you sort of like, I think you voiced exactly what I want to say, which is I think when we're thinking about how to be a better person, how to be a good person, we got to figure out what it is to be a good person, right? What is it that's sort of like common and peculiar to good people that makes them good people, right? And then once we've got some sort of settled view about that, we try to figure out the means, what we have to do to bring about the relevant features in ourselves, right? Now, I mean, thankfully, lots of people have thought long and hard about what it means to be a good person, right? So we can offload some of the work and read some philosophy. That'd be a fine way to spend your time. But to be honest, it's not even really clear you need to do that, right? Think hard about what's common to the people in your life that you take to be good people and try to emulate those people in the relevant ways as best as you can. Right? That seems like a reasonable sort of strategy. But I do think, as you suggested, if we're concerned to be better people or to be a good person, we would do well to think carefully about what that really means. Think about what is it to be a good person. And I think, as I said, one way of investigating that question is thinking about the people that we encounter in our own lives. Who are the good ones? Mm-hmm. What makes them good? And how can we sort of realize those good-making features in ourselves?
So I can see that any kind of philosophy that we adopt at some point, and I think it's probably very quickly, we're going to run into moral and ethical dilemmas, right? In living
Absolutely. Yes.
These philosophies.
Every day.
So can you give me some examples of, a philosophical approach to life and perhaps a common dilemma that ends up happening that we would face?
Absolutely. So I think one sort of question that we face more often than you think, every day, almost with respect to any choice of any substance at all, is how to balance considerations of self-interest, what's good for us, against sort of other regarding more altruistic considerations. And the reason I say that this question is sort of ubiquitous in everyday life is when you're thinking about whether to go to dinner at a fancy restaurant, right? Or to take a vacation, right? That's going to be good for you, right? You're going to get some enjoyment out of that. Alternatively, right? You could use the money that you would spend on those things to improve much more significantly the condition of people who are far worse off than you, right? Now, you think too much about that, it can drive you crazy, right? If you're just deciding whether to go to the movies with a friend on a Friday night and you think, look, like actually maybe I should send this money that I'd spend on my ticket to Oxfam. And by the way, there are some philosophers there are philosophers who think that that's exactly what you should do, that you should sort of donate to the point of marginal utility. But, there are sort of more moderate approaches or ways of thinking about that question as well, right? Maybe you think you have a bit of latitude with respect to sort of privileging your self-interest over altruistic considerations, at least in certain cases. But I think even if you don't go in for the sort of hardcore extreme view that says it's never okay to go to the nice restaurant, you should always be using that money to improve the condition of people who are worse off than you, right? Probably we should be privileging the more altruistic considerations more often than we do. And I think that sort of dilemma, that quandary is one that all of us face, like I said, every single day.
Now, are you saying that probably we might consider the more altruistic option because you're looking at the society as a whole and the fact that we have become much more consumer oriented, more materialistic? We acquire. I mean, is that why you're thinking maybe we should think a little bit more about others and the money we spend?
I guess this has sort of always been the case, right? I mean, I think, I think one of the fundamental philosophical questions in ethics and moral philosophy is like, okay, there's some stuff that's good for me, and sometimes what's good for me isn't what's good or better for everyone, right? Sometimes, like, I benefit at the expense of others, and what am I supposed to do with that information, right? In some sense, it's totally rational to act in my self-interest. At the same time, part of us thinks, maybe the part that's concerned with acting morally thinks, well, if I could do more good for others by foregoing something that's in my self-interest, then maybe that's what I should do. And I think but that problem, that question is not sort of like uniquely a feature of our sort of present circumstances. I think that's,
it's age old. It's timeless.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Do and I think what's so difficult though about that, I mean, As you mentioned, not just from the practical standpoint, because if you were to question everything you did, you would be just a blithering mess, and you wouldn't
Yes,
get anything done. But
absolutely.
beyond that, I think there's this aspect of happiness that's wrapped into it as well, right? And so we think by depriving ourselves, and maybe there's even a kind of a ceiling that we have, right? Where if we deprive ourselves too much, we become very unhappy because we don't get to go on that vacation. We didn't get a nice meal. We didn't get whatever it is, that article that we wanted, the clothing or, and so we're not happy. And so then is that a good thing? Like to determine how much to do for others and then how much to do for ourselves. Like, I don't know. It sounds tricky.
Yeah, it's extremely tricky. And there's even once you decide, suppose that you come down on the side of like, look, I'll make sacrifices in my own life to improve the condition of people who are worse off than me. Then there's still an extremely difficult question of how best to do that.
Right.
And there's sort of I want to call it a philosophical movement, but I think it's extended beyond that. That's called effective altruism, which is dedicated to the study of how we can best use resources that we're willing to give up to sort of maximize the well-being of people we're in a position to benefit. To put it sort of simply, it's like, well, I've got a choice of these charities that I could send my money to. Which one is going to make the most out of it? Right? There's a large group of people who like their careers are devoted to investigating that very question. And so that's a whole other sort of dimension of it as well.
Can you think of any other sort of moral and ethical dilemmas that we might run into? And that's a really good one. That's for sure a daily one.
I think, I'm sort of focusing on the kinds of things that are like so ordinary that they probably happen to you on a regular basis. You encounter them. And so, I mean, another example is I think sometimes, and this is sort of a puzzling phenomenon, some sort of course of action open to us will seem intuitively wrong, even if we can reasonably expect that it will have the best consequences that we're sort of in a position to produce. So, think about you're getting ready with your friend to go out for the night, right? And they ask you sort of, how do I look? Right? Okay. And the truth is not so great, right? But you know that if you tell them the truth, that's going to be an absolute disaster. You know for sure that the consequences are going to be way better if you lie, right? Now, maybe like lots of us would lie in that situation, right? And maybe that's the thing to do. But there's part of us that still has this sort of like reservation that look, like lying is not okay, right? And I bet some people listening would think like, look, no, you owe it to your friend to tell them the truth.
To tell them
but
the
this
truth.
Is sort of like a puzzling phenomenon, I think, if you reflect on it, which is like, how could it be wrong to do something, morally wrong to do something that we reasonably expect to have better consequences than any other alternative, right? How could it be wrong to do what's best?
I know, because, well, you don't want to hurt that person's feelings, et cetera, but I've wondered about that. I mean, because I have known not too many people who are brutally honest. And maybe they try and live by that. Maybe that actually is their philosophy. And that's difficult because they do end up offending a lot of people. On the other hand, people know that if they ask that person something, they are going to get a straight answer. So, I mean, I think probably maybe all of us, we do lie. I'm sure we do. I mean, I think probably all of us at some point have, varying degrees of lying.
I'm sure.
But what if we were trying to conduct our lives totally honestly? Like, what would that mean?
I think it would be pretty rough. I mean, there are some philosopher, most famously, Immanuel Kant, who think that there are certain types of action that are absolutely prohibited, morally wrong, regardless of the consequences. And one such type of action, he thought, was lying, being dishonest. There's a famous reply to Kant. Contemporary Benjamin Constant wrote this piece where he gives a following example of, your friend rushes into your house and this murderer is after me. They're chasing me. Can I hide? Okay, yeah, definitely. Go hide in the house. They hide. Then there's a knock at the door. It's the murderer. Where's your friend? Right? And Constant points out that Kant is committed to saying in this case that you're required to tell the truth because it's always morally wrong to lie, right?
Why can't hold it? Can I stop you?
Yeah.
Why can't the person say, I know where he is or she is, right? But I'm not going to tell you. That's not lying.
Is it not lying? I guess.
Why
it's true that you know where the person is.
Because you just said, yeah. You said, I know where that person is. Now, mind you, you're probably going to get killed now.
What if we, yes, that's absolutely right. And that's going to be a problem. I think you can like change the question asked by the murderer so that you can't get out of it that easily, right? Like the murderer might ask, is your friend in the house?
Yeah, right.
So there are ways of sort of living out. But I mean, the upshot is, and I think, look, like, I think many contemporary Kant scholars think Kant has a way out of this. Like there's the resources in Kant's sort of moral philosophy. And don't ask me how. I'm not a Kant scholar. But you might think like, look, we don't need extreme cases like that to show us that it just seems sort of intuitively implausible to think that there are certain types of action that are prohibited across the board, regardless of their consequences, right? Maybe we think like, maybe you even think in the case where you can lie to your friend, maybe you think it would be wrong to lie to your friend about how they look, even though you know that lying would have better consequences. Even if you think that, we're going to be able to cook up a case where it's going to seem like the thing to do is to lie. For example, in Constant's case of murder at the door. And I think you can cook up sort of similar cases for any type of action, that's claimed to be sort of like absolutely prohibited, regardless of the consequences.
Yeah, so it strikes me, I mean, and I guess you said this earlier, our philosophies of life, I mean, there are going to be exceptions, and it's difficult to make, to follow them in every single case in our life, right? It's more of a guide, I guess, of how to live our life. I'm also wondering whether our morals and our ethics, do they tend to change over time?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think there are two ways of understanding it. The question itself. So one way of understanding, I'm being an annoying philosopher, I'm sorry, but one way of understanding the question is, are you asking whether the ethical truths or moral truths themselves change? Another way of understanding the question is, do our moral beliefs change? Do our beliefs about the moral facts change? So I'm not sure that the moral facts, or at least like certain of them, ever change. But our beliefs certainly do, right? Okay,
so give me an example.
And hopefully, like an example of a moral fact.
Yeah.
This is inevitable. Yeah, this will inevitably be contentious. But when students ask me this, I think like there's always some reason not to torture people for fun. That seems like, again, that's not even to commit to the claim that you should never do that, right? Maybe there are super weird like science fiction cases where we think, yeah, you should do that. For example, if like a terrible dictator threatens to start a world war unless you torture someone for fun. Maybe you think like, in that case, fine, you should torture the person. But it's a weaker claim that just says, look, there's always something that counts against torturing people for fun. There's always some reason not to do that.
So you are saying then that it's impossible to come up with anything that is steadfast, any moral fact. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's impossible. And again, this is contentious. I think that it's impossible to come up with some sort of like exceptionless ethical principle that says what you ought to do across cases, what you ought to do, all things considered. But that's compatible with thinking that there are exceptionless principles about what you've got like some reason to do, right? So, it's not the case that you ought never to torture someone, because maybe again, we can, like, someone's going to start a world war unless someone gets tortured. It's reasonable, at least. It's not a totally crazy position to think like you should torture in that case. The claim is weaker that I'm making, which is that there is always some reason not to do that. But that reason might be outweighed. But what the unchangeable fact is that there's some reason not to. I mean, another easy example is like, the fact that doing something would make someone happy always counts in favor of it. There's always some reason to do what will make people happy. Of course, there are going to be cases where those reasons are beaten or outweighed, right? Because like doing the thing that will make this person happy will have terrible consequences. And so all things considered, we shouldn't do it. So on one way of understanding the question of whether our morals and ethics tend to change over time, I think certain moral facts of the kind that I was just describing probably don't change. And I think like the more interesting version of the question is like, do our moral beliefs change?
Yes.
Do what we sort of like, yeah. And then I think, yes, they certainly do. And hopefully for the better. And that's what we call moral progress, right?
Okay, so let me stop you. Let me just hold it.
Please.
Okay. So yeah, I can buy that. So, but when you say, do our moral beliefs for ourselves, can they change over time, right? Now I'm thinking in two ways. Moral beliefs, personal ones, right? That as an individual I hold. But what about as a society over time? Those can change too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think at least on certain views of what a society is, namely just like a collection of individual members, it will follow from the fact that individual moral beliefs change, that society's moral beliefs change. Now, there are other views about like what makes something a society where it might not be fully reducible to its sort of like the set of its individual members. And then the question becomes more complicated. But I think, luckily, fortunately, within our lifetimes, we have experienced sort of moral progress on the level of a shift in society's beliefs about certain issues, or at least like huge sections of society, their moral beliefs shifting. So I think like whether we're talking about the beliefs of individuals or the beliefs of groups, societies, I think, moral beliefs are susceptible to change, and we should hope that they do. Yeah.
Let's assume then that what you say is true. And I think I believe it to be true that generally speaking, we've made gains and we've had some moral progress, right? So let's just say that's a given.
Yeah.
But our world right now, we're becoming more fractured, more divided. And that's whether it's politics or race or, socioeconomics. So, I mean, are those two? I mean, is that connected, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think progress doesn't come easy, and I think it sort of never has. And so the fact that we're facing all sorts of challenges and sort of moving forward morally today, there's certainly precedent for that in the past as well. And what is the answer? I mean, what do we do? I mean, I think when it comes to the issue of like division, for example, or people sort of being fractured in their fundamental moral and political beliefs, how do we become sort of more empathetic to people's points of view? How do we sort of bridge the sort of divides that have emerged? I think lots of practice and effort, lots of sort of sustained effort.
I'm glad you brought up the empathy question, because this is something that I've heard discussions around as well. So many people talk about the need for more empathy today, because people seem to be, focused on their own belief, perhaps at the exclusion of someone else, and that can be detrimental. However, and this is what's come up in a discussion. How can we be empathetic to someone else's point of view while at the same time we're trying to think critically. And we feel that by being empathetic and not taking this hard, firm stand on what we believe, that it's dangerous. That by doing that, there's actually going to be a dangerous outcome. And I can give the example of, say, vaccinations, right? So you have people who believe that it's good and it protects people. You have people who feel, for many reasons, right? It's either not good for their health or it's against their fundamental right, or whatever their reason is. And so then now, how do you how do you get to a compromise there, right? You can be empathetic, perhaps, but you're either going to get that vaccination or you're not.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you just sort of pointed to one of the deepest and hardest problems that we face today. I think the mistake a lot of us are making today in these instances of division, is to be sort of inflammatory and aggressive in response to the people we disagree with. And I think that insofar as our aim is to help those people to come around to the view that we take to be correct, that's going to be counterproductive. Now, again, even here, there are exceptions. Like, I certainly do not want to be understood as suggesting that anger in response to people voicing certain of their views is never called for. Right? There's stuff that like legitimately warrants sort of like an angry, aggressive response. Okay. The thought is just that both sort of sides on these issues being insulting and dismissive of one another is not going to facilitate progress. Now, I'm not sure like exactly what does facilitate progress. Like, I'm not sure how you sit down with the anti-vaxxer who's an anti-vaxxer for like weird conspiracy theory reasons and try to like convince them that this, that's a difficult task. But I do know that like there are certain ways of engaging with people that complicate the process of their coming around rather than facilitate it. And so we should be thinking carefully about how to engage with people in ways that are productive, is the thought.
People might think, okay, so how is all this? We started off talking about a philosophy of life. That's what this is, though, right? It's all these different philosophies that butt up against each other.
Absolutely.
Like, that's what's happening.
Or at least different, or at least like, a philosophy of life or sort of a philosophical approach to life is like really broad. These are at least like really important moral beliefs and political beliefs that people have that guide their behavior that are bumping up against one another, right? Which makes like the task of trying to resolve those sorts of disagreements productively really, really important.
You teach philosophy to young people at McGill University. I'd like to know, what are you seeing with your students when it comes to their philosophical approach to their lives? Like, what do you hear? What do they say to you?
Yeah, my students at McGill are absolutely amazing. They are, I think, understandably anxious about certain aspects of the world today. But for the most part, in my experience, they're remaining hopeful. And they're looking for ways to sort of improve their own condition and the conditions of others. Okay, they're very socially conscious, okay? And they're, in my experience, again, at least, committed to problem solving as opposed to something like problem wallowing. Right? They want to get out and do something. They seem sort of really motivated and interested to tackle today's problems, and in the kinds of ways that we've been discussing. Right? Checking themselves and others and their sources of information for biases. I think they're hip to that in a way that like previous generations are not so much. And I think they're looking at and for well-reasoned approaches to the problems that they see with the world today. So they make me pretty optimistic, I have to say.
That's good to hear. I work with a fair amount of young people in their 20s and 30s, and I'm so impressed with their awareness. When I think of myself when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I did not have the same kind of awareness they did, and the same kind of sense of social justice.
Yes. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and
I think
you
it's
know what?
really powerful, and I'm
Yeah.
heartened by it. Yeah.
And I'm curious to know about yourself too. Do you have a philosophical approach or sort of a philosophy of life for yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that like by virtue of being a philosopher, you're necessarily like better at any of the stuff that we've been talking about. So like,
Oh,
I think,
I think we assume that, I think people
yeah,
actually
yeah.
assume like, oh, they got it together. They're
Yeah, yeah. Not,
philosophers.
I think probably not so much. Uh, so, but I'm at least sort of like, I'm thinking about this stuff, right? It's sort of like active, at least in the back of my mind. And I catch myself doing things, like I'll be like scrolling through Twitter and someone says something and I find myself being like, just like kind of unreflectively, just like accepting it. Like maybe not outright believing it, but just like being like, oh yeah, that's like a data point. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute, what? I don't know who this person is. Like, I don't know like what their evidence is. Like, why am I sort of so I think about those kinds of things and I try to like check myself, but I founder constantly, right? And I'm always sort of like trying to self-correct in these ways. And as for like a broader philosophy of life, I'm just kind of out here doing the best that I can, I guess, one day at a time. Uh, just kind of winging it. So
One day at a time. Yeah. What would you like people to take away from this conversation? What do you hope?
yeah, so I guess I think it can be difficult for some people to see the value of philosophy and philosophical thinking. So I think,
Yeah.
it kind of has like a reputation of being concerned with like some pretty recherche questions, like how many angels can like dance on the head of a pin type stuff.
Or that
And like
yeah. Sorry, no, I was just going to say, or that you end up going down rabbit holes. I think people
yeah,
think that
totally.
as
And
well,
like,
right? Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And to be fair, like guilty. I mean, yeah, people, like philosophy has been concerned with stuff like that. But I kind of, I guess, there's something about like philosophical practice, right? The sort of skills and sensitivities and capacities for critical thinking and reasoning that just engaging in the enterprise cultivates. And I think it's the value of these elements of a philosophical approach to life that I think can be especially clear, whether you're concerned about obscure stuff or just like practical problems that you face every day. And really, honestly, no matter what you do, these capacities, the
Hmm.
skills I think that philosophical thinking can cultivate are going to benefit you no matter what type of problems you're trying to solve in your own work or in your life more broadly. I just think they have clear value. And so I guess I hope that we, through this conversation, have helped clarify that somewhat and made the value of philosophical practice a little more evident.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary.
That is Chris Howard. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at McGill University, and he specializes in ethics and moral philosophy. To find out more about Chris and his work, you can check out our show notes. That's it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. And you might also be interested in our literary podcast. It's called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram podcast. Thanks for listening and see you here next time.